call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise this evening in this grievance debate to draw attention to the unprecedented cruelty of this government and the complete lack of humanity that we've seen from the Morrison Government. The Morrison Government has no vision for Australia because they don't care about Australians, only themselves and hanging on to government. And we see that no more than this week, where they're focused on their internal leadership struggles while we're in a global pandemic. And we've seen the member for New England back as the Deputy Prime Minister while we still have many people waiting for when they can be vaccinated, and seeing this week that people are going to have to stop getting the Pfizer vaccine for their first dose because we don't have enough of it and we need to prioritise those who can get their second dose. These should be the issues that are at the forefront of this government's mind this week, but instead we're seeing leadership challenges and a new Deputy Prime Minister. Nothing typifies the cruelty of this government more than their treatment of the Morrison family, the Biloela family, where we had to see a little 3-year-old girl airlifted to Perth from detention in Christmas Island with untreated pneumonia that led to a blood infection before this government could say that they could stay here in Australia, as their community in Biloela and many other Australians from around the country and people in this place have been calling now for many years. But it took images of that little girl for this in hospital for this government to realise that they had to do something. But as usual, they just do the bare minimum. Rather than letting this family return to Biloela, where their community have been crying out for them to be returned, they are in community detention in Perth. And while it's better than being in detention on Christmas Island, it's not good enough. They should be sent straight home to Biloela. And there are so many questions around this. Why were these little children in detention? When in 2019 the government said there would be no children in detention, and they remained in detention, the only family there at Christmas Island. And the reason is because this government wanted to make an example of it. To make an example, to scare people to come here exercising their legal right to seek asylum. And the question as to why a little girl was left seriously ill and untreated for 10 days until it was serious enough that she needed to be airlifted to hospital with a blood infection. And as a mother of a 3-year-old, I can tell you I would be so heartbroken to see my child in that state, and that is what this government is happy to let people go through, and in fact perhaps saw it as a political opportunity, not even a problem. This is also the government that brought us robo-debt, where the government went after some of the most vulnerable Australians with bogus social security debts, sometimes from many years previously, put the onus of proof onto those people to prove that they didn't have the debt, rather than the government needing to prove that they had the debt, and pursued them with debt collectors. The Supreme Court has now approved a $1.8 billion settlement for people wrongfully pursued by the Morrison Government's robo-debt scheme. 433,000 people had $1.73 billion in debts raised against them. $751 million was wrongfully recovered from 381,000 people. And Justice Bernard Murphy has said, this has resulted in a huge waste of public money. The proceeding has exposed a shameful chapter in the administration of the Commonwealth social security system and a massive failure of public administration. He said that one thing that stands out is the financial hardship, anxiety and distress, including suicidal ideation and in some cases suicide, that people or their loved ones say was suffered as a result of the robo-debt system, and that many say that they felt shame and hurt at being wrongfully branded welfare cheats, he said. And that's just another example of this government pursuing the most vulnerable as part of a scare campaign against ordinary Australians. Don't be on welfare because we'll come after you and you might end up in jail. We'll get debt collectors after you if, 5 years ago when you were on youth allowance, you wrongfully reported your income and had a small debt which, will now be pursued by debt collectors. This is a government that thinks an increase to the job seeker payment of $3.57 per day is adequate. That living on $43.57 per day is okay in a country like Australia, that people can get by on that woefully inadequate payment. In March 2020, the Australian government lifted almost 500,000 Australians out of poverty, including 75,000 children, by introducing the coronavirus supplement worth $550 per fortnight. That's according to research from the Australia Institute. And we welcome that. That was a great move from this government, and it acknowledged that job seeker was too low to live on. And so when we knew that many people were going to become unemployed as a result of the pandemic, they were happy to increase that payment. And the result was that we saw people coming out of poverty. But then all these gains were lost as the government incrementally cut that coronavirus supplement throughout 2020. And between March and December in 2020, an additional 900,000 Australians fell into poverty, including 200,000 children. And then alongside this pathetic increase that they've made to JobSeeker, they also introduced a dob-in-a-dole bludger hotline for people to report social security recipients who aren't taking jobs. And these are the things that this government are concerned with, pursuing the most vulnerable in our community to make people feel fearful. And, that's not what Australia is about. We are an egalitarian and inclusive community. We look after each other when we need to. I think that's what most Australians would like to see, and they see the government having an important role in that, including with our social security system. This government has also still failed to deal with the incredibly serious allegations of sexual harassment and violence in this place. I mean, we've seen the very courageous Brittany Higgins bravely come forward and talk about her experience, and then to sit in question time, to go out to the March for Justice in March and to come back into question time and have, first of all, the Prime Minister say that we were lucky that we weren't shot at. Aren't we lucky that we can protest? But then over preceding weeks to see him fail to answer the most basic questions about asking his staff about their involvement in this, about were they backgrounding journalists against Brittany Higgins' loved ones. I don't think we ever got a decent answer to that. I don't feel like these things have been dealt with. The member for Bowman also has some incredibly serious allegations against him, and yet we've seen the government voting to protect his position as a chair of a committee in this place. So what does that say to the women of Australia about this government's view about sexism and violence against women? Do they take it seriously? Are they going to do something about it? They said that they did a lot for women in the budget, but just putting the word women onto the front of things doesn't actually address these problems. And I know that the women in my electorate remain incredibly angry that these things are not being dealt with. We have a deep-seated cultural problem with violence against women in this country, with domestic violence and sexism. And to see it fail to be dealt with in the Parliament, which should be the exemplar, we should be leading the way with regard to these matters, is incredibly disappointing, to say the least. And to see the Prime Minister fail to take a proper interest even, or to ask the right questions about a very young member of the government staff, I just find incredibly disturbing. The NDIS is another issue that I spend a lot of time on as a member on the NDIS Parliamentary Committee. And to hear the absolutely heartbreaking stories there of people battling to get the most basic supports, and then to have the Minister say that we're relying too much on the empathy of public servants. It's simply not good enough. This is a government that does not care about people. They are not on your side, they are not listening, and they have no plan other than to deal with what they see as political problems, always doing the bare minimum, but not actually caring, not actually walking in the footsteps of the people they represent and the issues that are facing them. Coming after the most vulnerable time and time again, people receiving social security, refugees, women, You know, people who were left out of their response to the coronavirus pandemic, such as, you know, international students, casual workers.
The question is that the grievance has been